Hi everyone, this is Lorraine Driscoll, founder of Building Better Brains, and today we're going to be talking about the signs of a reading disorder. So the first thing I want to address is I've used the word reading disorder instead of the word dyslexia because I really want to reaffirm the misconception that reading disorder and dyslexia is interchangeable. So dyslexia is a type of reading disorder. It is definitely the most common one. It is the most common learning disability. However, it does not by any means, it's not by any means interchangeable with reading disorders. So there is other types of reading disorders such as visual processing disorder, and I could go on and on. So the first thing I want to say before I talk about the signs to watch for in terms of reading disorders is that obviously your child might not necessarily have all of these reading disorders, or signs I should say, and don't panic if they have 2 or 3. If your child's 4 years old and I mentioned 3 things that your child is doing, it doesn't necessarily mean they have dyslexia or a reading disorder. It could just mean that, they have a few little glitches, so to speak. My daughter had many issues with a neuroimmune condition, and fortunately reading is one of the things that it did not affect. However, she did do a few things that made me go, oh my goodness, is she going to develop dyslexia as well? So last time I talked about early screening and the importance of that. So screening basically begins with identifying the early signs. And the early signs for the physical aspect is the one that I see the most in my office, the one that parents tell me all the time, because I admit I do ask them, but I would say 95% of my clients who have reading disorders or dyslexia say that their child skipped crawling, barely crawled, or that they were an early walker. And or the other one was that they were a bum shuffler, so they kind of slid from where they wanted to, from where they were to where they wanted to go by just kind of dragging themselves across the floor on their bum. And that is because what happens is that when a child skips crawling, they're not getting the integration of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain. So the other aspect that I don't want to say is a hard and fast rule, and it's definitely not something major, but it can be a small indication, is a lazy eye, as well as poor eye tracking or poor eye teaming. So sometimes this is really, really obvious. Other times this is not so obvious. If it's obvious, you'll notice that your child just isn't quite following something correctly. Sometimes if they're actually in the phase where they're reading, they could be skipping lines or not being able to kind of follow along very well, and they have to use their finger. Sometimes they have poor drawing skills or poor penmanship. And so that can be a sign. But again, I have lots of kids coming in. They don't have poor penmanship. Their art skills are not too bad. And the parents have never really noticed anything with their eye tracking, and yet whenever I do a screening, there is some definite glitches and so forth. Family history. So there is definitely a genetic component to dyslexia. It doesn't mean that it's always caused by genetics. There's many factors, which I will get into more detail another time. However, family history is in studies done on identical twins, there is a 50% chance that if one twin has dyslexia, the other one will. So as you can see, that's not a definite hard and fast indication that, your child's going to have dyslexia, but it's definitely something to be aware of, that if you know dyslexia runs in your side of the family or your husband's side of the family or both, then you definitely want to keep an eye out for those warning signs to get on top of it as soon as possible. History of ear infections or chronic infections, but particularly ear infections. There is a big link with that, with dyslexia as well as ADHD. And that is because even though hearing might not become impaired, it can affect the auditory processing and affect aspects related to phonemic awareness and so forth. History of antibiotics, by the way, is the same thing. So if there are issues with chronic infections as an infant, I've talked quite a bit in the past about the brain-gut connection and how antibiotics can really disrupt the gut ecology and how that affects the brain. So obviously that can have an impact as well. So, and obviously hearing problems in general. I should mention, not just ear infections, but hearing problems in general puts your child at a higher risk for dyslexia because it could impact their ability to develop phonemic awareness as well as to have good, strong auditory processing. In terms of just language in general, so it's not uncommon for people who struggle with reading disorders to be late talkers, to have limited vocabulary, to have a hard time finding their words. Sometimes they just don't talk a lot, or they're using shorter sentences. Like I said, trouble finding their words, and then sometimes it even goes as far as they have speech difficulties or pronouncing words. And I gave the example, I think I gave the example of my daughter who used to say Paschetti. She wasn't dyslexic, but for the longest time she didn't say spaghetti, and there's some common words that kids kind of tend to mix up. So again, don't panic if your child's doing that, but if there's a lot of other signs, then you might want to kind of investigate that further. The other aspect, so whenever we teach reading, one of the things we really do in pre-reading, when teaching, if you will, or when we're teaching literacy before kids actually begin the process of learning to read, is we really teach them phonemic awareness as well as recognizing rhyming pattern, because that helps to develop their phonemic awareness and helps to kind of fine-tune their ears. However, children who have dyslexia, as well as other reading disorders, but particularly dyslexia, where they have an impaired phonemic awareness, they tend to have a hard time recognizing the difference between, not recognizing, but they just don't find or notice that cat and rat and sat kind of has a cool sound to it or a cool rhythm. To them, it's just kind of neutral and big deal and so forth. Or they might generally have a hard time rhyming because they just don't pick it up. They might have a hard time forming words or forming sounds and so forth. So any kind of issues with speech and so forth. The other thing that is really common with dyslexia and reading disorders is what we call mixed dominance. So some people will kind of think that it's a good thing that their child is using the right hand for one thing and their left hand for another thing. However, oftentimes mixed dominance means that there's some poor coordination and some kind of brain disorganization going on because of poor brain development or weak brain development. Signs of mixed dominance is having a hard time learning to tie their shoes, even just poor coordination in general. Like sometimes just something as simple as when I have a child like, okay, touch your right hand to your left knee and so forth. They might have a hard time with dance, learning, dance routines and so forth. And by the way, those things are really good for them if they do have a hard time with that. They also will be the kids who have a difficulty learning or distinguishing their left and their right. And as I said, they might use both hands for, maybe ambidextrous. And as well, just watching for poor fine motor skills. It's not uncommon for children with reading disorders and dyslexia to have dysgraphia as well, where they have just very poor penmanship. And sometimes it looks like they're lazy and they're just not taking their time. And there's a whole other reason that I'll get into another time why they might have poor fine motor skills. Another factor that has been recently noted, and I've noticed it quite a bit in the last few years too, is just sensory processing issues. I can't tell you how many kids come in, they have dyslexia, they have a reading disorder, often they have other stuff going on like ADHD as well, but they have sensory processing issues where they either are super sensitive to socks, tags, seams, and so forth, or sounds, or they're totally not. It's the complete other end of the spectrum where they're sensory seeking in terms of being overly touchy-feely and maybe being too rough because they don't realize their own strength. Another factor related to sensory motor is dyspraxia. So being prone to accidents, being clumsy, having poor balance, just all that is really, really tied in and linked. One kind of can go hand in hand. So processing difficulties in terms of cognitive processing difficulties that are really common among children who are dyslexic or who have reading disorders is these kids can often have difficulty following a series of instructions. So parents will often say, I can't tell, Timmy to go get his socks and to clean up his room and to make sure he packs his lunch and to do this, because he comes back and he does one thing and he truly genuinely forgot or didn't remember. And so I can only tell him two things at the most. So just kind of following a series of instructions can be a real challenge for these kids. planning can be really overwhelming. If you notice that your kid just doesn't seem to, has a lot of difficulty with organization and breaking things down into smaller chunks or tasks. And difficulty remembering a sequence of events. So whether it's a story they read, whether it's, something happened at school and they're telling you what happened, or maybe something happened and you were there as well, so it didn't happen in that particular order that they're describing. Those are all clues that there could be some processing difficulties. And last but not least, I was just talking to a mom today. She said, it's kind of weird, but he has poor memory, but he has good memory. And I know exactly what she means. These kids often have poor working memory, like naming letters, numbers and colors and so forth, or remembering them and retaining them. But in other ways, they can have an incredible memory because they have to rely so much on their memory as a coping mechanism. That's more as they get older, however. They have developed their memory in order to cope and kind of, remain a little bit invisible regarding how much they're struggling with their disorder. As they get into preschool and kindergarten, there's some other more obvious signs that you can watch for. A hard time learning their letters, learning their alphabet, recognizing letters in their own name can all be signs that they're having some visual processing issues, some working memory issues, and so forth. Just general difficulty learning how to spell and to write his or her own name, just letters in general, and the whole process of literacy is not as easy. It's not that it's easy, but it's a grueling task, and they just don't seem to be catching on. Reversals, so reversing letters, obviously some of that is normal to a certain extent, but as I've mentioned in my last video, dyslexia is identifiable with 92% accuracy by 5.5. So if your child's still reversing letters in grade 1 or grade 2, particularly in grade 3 and 4, don't let anybody tell you that it's too early to tell. Last one for that particular one is not retaining sounds. So just can't remember that B goes ba and I don't know, S goes. It's just not sticking. So what is really going on underneath when a child has a reading disorder? Basically, they have incomplete brain development. That's one factor, I should say. They often skipped crawling, skipped creeping. There are some factors that cause their brain to not be organized the way it should optimally be organized. Poor auditory and visual processing is one of the main underlying root causes, if you will, or factors whenever there's reading disorders. Weak or poor phonemic awareness or a phonemic deficit is huge, particularly with dyslexia. That's kind of the definition of dyslexia. And one that's often overlooked and I've seen really good results with is poor nutrition. So if you improve nutrition, it's amazing how sometimes all of a sudden reading can really turn around. And I don't want to suggest that that's the cause of dyslexia. I feel like that would really be going a stretch. But sometimes with kids, obviously if their brain is not getting what it needs, then nutrition, can really turn things around. So the key is to get it early. The sooner you get it, the less likely a child is going to struggle and kind of develop that stigma and that low self-esteem that so often tends to go with reading struggles and so forth. And the sooner we recognize it, the sooner we can organize the brain. So the amazing thing is the brain is super plastic. All of the leading experts in dyslexia and reading disorders know that we can improve reading, that nobody should be unable to read, that dyslexics can learn how to read. However, obviously, like anything, early intervention goes a long, long way. And basically, we want to correct the underlying factors that are contributing to your child having such a hard time learning to read so that they have a more positive experience of school and learning and so forth. So I hope this kind of gave you an idea of what to look for. If you're kind of still wondering what could be going on, feel free to email me, message me, contact me. Maybe even we can set up a free 20-minute consult. And if you liked this video, feel free to share, and don't hesitate to go to my website, www.lorrainedriscoll.com. I'll post the link in the comments below. Thanks for watching.